Hello, and welcome to the course of U.S. history. I am your host, as always, Mr. Samuelson. Last time we met, we talked about the empires of the South, and we took a while to look at the Mayan, Aztec, and Incan civilizations. But this time, we're going to shift our focus over to Europe to find out what is going on in Europe that leads to this age of exploration and the Spanish showing up in North America. But first, let's look at some earlier explorers. See, the first explorers to look at North America were not the Spanish. They were the Norse, or the Vikings. And their lead explorer was this man, Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson is this Viking explorer who is going to be checking out Greenland for potential colonies when he gets blown off course and lands in North America. He'll be the first Viking to explore the North American shores. And in North America, he lands, gets off his boat, walks up on shore, and becomes the first European in North America. It is not Christopher Columbus. Leif Erikson was the first. Now, what does he do there? Well, he takes a look around. Remember, he's exploring, so he doesn't have a lot of stuff with him. This isn't trade or colonization. He just looks around to find out what it is that he has found. And he sees a lot of natural grapes. Grapes are used for making wine, so he names this place the Land of Wine, or what we now call Vinland. Now, a few years later, he had initially landed in 1000 CE. In 1009 CE, the Norse return. And there's about 100 men and women that settle down and create a colony called Vinland. They want to raise more of these grapes. They want to create their own wine, and they want to bring that back to where the Norse live in Scandinavia and Iceland. Problem is, they come into conflict with those who already live there. The Native Americans, they grow to be distrustful and not really like the Vikings too much. And it's suspected that there was conflict between these two groups. The Vinland colonists were simply overwhelmed. They were far from their home and far from help, and they're going to abandon their colony, and they're going to leave because of this conflict with Native Americans. And consequently, the Vinland colony is not historically significant. The Vikings will tell stories of it in sagas, but there's no permanent settlement. There's no continuing trade. And over time, people come to believe that this is just a story. Vikings never sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. They never created a colony until the site of the actual colony was discovered in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, people finally came to understand it wasn't Christopher Columbus who first sailed to North America. It was, in fact, these Vikings, even though the historical impact of it was very insignificant for Europe. Well, let's look at Europe as a whole. Europe in the Middle Ages was kind of a mess. When the Roman Empire, or the western half of the Roman Empire, collapses in 476 CE, government collapses, culture collapses, technology collapses, unity collapses. And Europe shatters into hundreds of smaller kingdoms. Western Europe, in any case, shatters into hundreds of small kingdoms. Within these kingdoms, individuals rise up and try to take charge. And they do this through the feudal system. In a feudal system, you might have a king up at the top. And the king will protect his nobles in exchange for the nobles providing him goods and services and men for his armies. The nobles have the same deal with the knights, and the knights are over the serfs and the peasants. So this is our feudal hierarchy, where everybody owes something to somebody below them and gains something from somebody below them. This is our feudal system, with the king at the top collecting most of the wealth and most of the goods. Yeah, it's good to be the king. And then you've got the serfs down at the bottom. Well, yeah. Serfs, S-E-R-Fs, not surfing. Sorry, very different spelling, very different meaning. Yeah, sorry dude, you don't get to surf. Instead, you get to be a serf. and most people were serfs. And serfdom is really just a form of slavery. And this is where 90% of the population of Europe was. They were working in the fields, producing food that would belong to somebody else. Now, the feudal system itself is going to be in place for about 500 years. In fact, in some places it lasts longer than 500 years. But most everywhere in Europe had some variety of a feudal system for about 500 years, with those kings up atop and the lords and the knights and the serfs. It's going to break down because the economy is going to change. More people are going to have more access to the rest of the world. They're going to see what's going on. They're going to see different ways of living, and they're going to want out of serfdom. Serfdom was not good. The feudal system didn't work very well for the people of Europe. It worked so poorly that, in fact, we name the period where feudalism was at its height the Dark Age. The Dark Age was not a time that you wanted to live in Europe. It was not a good time for anybody. It was a lot of warfare, a lot of conflict, a lot of starvation. It just wasn't a high point in European history. One thing that does come out of the Middle Ages, though, the later Middle Ages, is towns start to reappear. After Rome had collapsed, basically city living disappeared throughout most of Europe. But towns slowly start to reappear as merchants want to go places where there are a lot of people to sell their goods. Now, these towns were not great. They were crowded, they were dirty, they attracted a lot of disease, and in particular, in the mid-1300s, they're going to attract a disease called the bubonic plague, which gets nicknamed the Black Death. In the Black Death, about a quarter of all Europeans are going to die. It's a nasty, nasty illness that wiped out a lot of Europe. But something good does come out of it. See, when a quarter of the population dies, you don't need as much food to feed your whole population. But all the farms are in place, all the land is cleared, so you can still produce the same amount of food, you just need less of it. So you can start to sell that food. You can start to make more of an income. And once people have a little bit more money, they can change their position in life. And they can leave the farms and they can leave serfdom and find a different life in towns. The Crusades are going to be important to this as well. From 1096 until 1270 CE, the Crusades sent Europeans to the Middle East. It was called by Pope Urban II. He wanted to go to the Middle East, and in particular, he wanted to recapture the city of Jerusalem, which had fallen out of Christian hands a long time ago and is a very important city in Christian religion. So a series of wars over 200 years are fought to capture this city. There's a lot of stories in this one, but I'm going to summarize it just by saying that the Christian armies lose. In the end, they lose. They can't recapture this city. However, in the end, they come back with these stories of incredible wealth. The Muslim civilization, Muslim societies are far wealthier than Europeans, and they have all of these luxuries, all of this great stuff that they just don't have in Europe. And people want that stuff. Yeah, it's good to be the Sultan. It's good to live in the Islamic world at this time. They've got a lot of really good stuff. They're rich. So merchants hear about this stuff, and they want the wars to end. They want the Crusades to end so that they can get in there and peacefully trade with these people to get access to these goods. But how are they going to make that happen? Well, one thing they're going to do is they're going to reach out to the kings within this feudal system to be an ally. And the merchants and the kings are going to work together to bring about an end to crusading. Now, they do this with the merchants supporting the kings. And once the merchants are loaning money to the kings can pay for armies instead of being dependent on their nobles for armies. France is a great way to look at this. These are two maps of France. And in this one, we've got this blue area right here is actually all that the king controlled. Most of France was in the hand of his nobles. His nobles were more powerful than he was. But he starts to get the backing of these other groups. And over time, the kings of France expand. so that their personal holdings here are in blue. The green are still territories that are controlled by the King of France, and the nobles are increasingly pushed out. By 1223, there's really only a couple of other significant nobles within France, and the king is in charge. And he's done this through hundreds of years of partnerships with this rising middle class. With peace and trade came the prosperity and power of the middle class. Merchants are becoming more wealthy, they're becoming more powerful. In many cases, they're becoming more wealthy and more powerful than the lords. And what we see is an end to the feudal system. Once you don't need lords and knights, once you don't have to have that, once you have a rising middle class, you start to see a shift in society. And by 1450, we call this shift in society a renaissance or a rebirth. It's Europe putting behind this feudal system that locked them into a certain set way of life. And the middle class is more interested in some other things. They're not interested in waging wars. They're interested in art and science and bringing back some of their Roman heritage. It's the end of 1,000 years of comparable darkness. And it's the beginning of Europeans rising to a dominant position in the world. Next time, we're going to look at one European nation and its efforts to explore the world and to gain even greater wealth through some important trade with China and India. That's coming up next. Thank you for joining me for the course of U.S. history, and farewell.